At my signal, unleash hell.
Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. And as I think most of the listeners to the podcast know, I generally do history, but I do like to mix in the movies as well. And today's show is very much a mix of movie and history because I have two brilliant historians of the ancient world who have come on to talk about the movie Gladiator, and talking about it both as a movie and talking about it as history. And I'll start by introducing Bret Devereaux. Bret is very much a friend of the podcast in that he's been on 3 times before. He talked about the ancient Mediterranean, and he's also come on to talk about what the Lord of the Rings can teach us about military history. Bret lectures at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and he's the writer of the brilliant and massively popular and influential blog which goes by the name of A Collection of Unmitigated Pedantry. So welcome, Bret, to the podcast.
Great to be here.
And my second guest is Edward Watts, and he's also been on the podcast before. Ed, will you never learn? And so Ed is Professor of History at the University of California, San Diego. And like Bret, he's a great communicator of history, and his latest book, The Eternal Decline and Fall of Rome, explores all sorts of interesting angles and thought-provoking ideas as it talks about Roman history from the earliest days all the way up to the fall of Constantinople, and I really can't recommend it highly enough. Ed also has a YouTube channel which is called Rome's Eternal Decline, and there's an absolute ton of really good lectures and shorter pieces on Rome from its earliest days right up to the very end. And so welcome, Ed, to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
So let's get into it. We're here to talk about the film Gladiator, and it came out in the year 2000. And at the time, I was completely blown away by it, and I thought it was just magnificent. I was kind of interested to come back to it after all these years to see how it had aged and see whether I was still of the same opinion. But I'm also interested in it as a way of talking about a period of Roman history that doesn't get too much attention, which is sort of the end of the Antonines. So I'll set the scene exactly as the film does. In the winter of 180 AD, Emperor Marcus Aurelius's 12-year campaign against the barbarian tribes in Germania was drawing to an end. Just one final stronghold stands in the way of a Roman victory and the promise of peace throughout the empire. I have a million things I'd like to ask, but shall we kick off with the opening 15 minutes of the film? Because that has probably one of the most famous battle scenes in film history, I think. So let's start with you, Bret. How did you rate the battle both as drama and as history?
Yeah, so I mean, as drama, it's unmatched. I think I'm going to do a lot of nitpicking about Gladiator here. So I want to note on the outset, I enjoy this movie. This movie is fun. As a film, it definitely holds up, even if, as history, it's taking a lot of license. But it's a fun movie, and the battle scene here, the scale that they shoot it at, we got an army of extras and we're just going to do this. I mean, they don't make them like that anymore. It's great. As a depiction of Roman warfare, hit or miss, with more misses than hits. The clear hits is the visual design. The sort of equipment of the Roman soldiers is about right. Lots of lorica segmentata on the legionaries, lots of lorica hamata, that is mail, on everybody else. We've got, scutum, we see pila, the heavy Roman javelin, we see period-appropriate gladii, although we should probably by this point be seeing more of the longer sword, the spatha. But a lot of that is about right. We see a lot of catapults, some of which closer to Roman designs than others. But a lot of catapults make sense. Roman armies in this period, at least to believe later sources that describe the legion of this period, seem to have brought a lot of catapults with them, and occasionally used the lighter pieces in field battles, so that works out. And the sort of place and context of the battle is about right. I mean, Marcus Aurelius was engaged in what really seemed to be this sort of endless campaign on the Danube, and he was there personally. So that more or less checks out. Note that means that we are fairly far south in Germany, rather than up on the Rhine. Beyond that, everything gets to be kind of a mess almost immediately. So the Romans start out deployed in these field fortifications. Look, the Romans loved themselves some field fortifications. They built a fortified camp every night on the march. They did not fight in them. Roman armies liked to form in nice open battlefields. They were very much an offensive instrument, an attacking instrument. And so you don't form up the army in the camp. That's a good way to get bottled up and have trouble getting into formation. You form up the army in front of the camp. So I wouldn't expect to see the Roman army formed up in its field fortifications. Those are a fallback position. The army itself, really, just to begin, has way too many archers. It seems like half this army are archers. The Romans used archers from other parts of their empire. The Romans were not great archers themselves, but it was very much a supporting arm. The Romans expected to do the job with swords at close range. And so, there's the whole sort of unleash hell scene where all the catapults and archers are just firing. And that's not really, the Romans will use that kind of thing, but not as heavily. I'm put in mind of Arrian's array against the Alani. It's a battle plan for fighting horse archers that's fairly close to this period. And his army has only a small detachment of archers that are deployed on one flank. Other than that, he relies on javelins as his missile troops, along with arrow-throwing catapults. The archers were a very subsidiary kind of element of the Roman fighting system.
Can I just ask, why is that? Because one of the things the Romans have got is plenty of time to train their troops. And archery is sort of an art that takes a lot of time to train your troops. So that's one of the reasons the English were so good in the 100 Years' War, is that they had trained their archers, and that takes a hell of a long time. So I just wonder, why don't the Romans use archers any more than they do?
I think part of it is just what your culture produces and what you're good at. Italy produces really good heavy infantry, and so that's what they use. But you're also dealing with a sort of military environment where, your main threats are, if you're a Roman legion, your main threats are another Roman legion in a civil war. They have these great big shields, the scutum, so they're functionally immune to your arrow fire. They're going to march straight through it. Or you could be facing, Germanic-speaking peoples. They also carry great big shields, usually oval shields. So they are also going to march straight through your arrow fire and take relatively few casualties and engage you in close combat. Or the other option is you may be fighting the Parthians, who will just outshoot you, because they are an archer culture, a horse archer culture. They're just going to outshoot you. So you need archers. You want that capability in your army, but it's not something you focus on. And then also, you don't use fire arrows. Like the scene, fire arrows are cool. You can see them so clearly in the kind of dark scene. They look awesome. So the Romans did have incendiary ranged weapons, whether for catapults or arrows or even incendiary javelins. We recover these archaeologically. Roman fire arrows and fire javelins are distinctive in type. They have this little hollow diamond behind the point where you could wrap a sort of rag soaked in oil or pitch that you would ignite and then fling at somebody. So they're very identifiable. The thing is, adding that incendiary mass throws off the weight of the arrow, so you lose a lot of range and striking power. And they don't have napalm, right? They don't have gelatinized incendiaries. What they've got is like olive oil that's burning, and an olive oil soaked rag will burn, but the human body is like 70-80% water. It's not going to generate enough heat to light a person on fire. It's not going to generate enough heat to light a forest on fire. What you used fire arrows and javelins and other things for was sieges, where you could fling them over the walls and try and light things like buildings made of dried timber or thatch roofs to distract defenders and create chaos. That was where you could use incendiary rounds, but you wouldn't use them on the battlefield like this. You'd use regular arrows.
I wondered what kind of war we were being shown here. It almost felt like we're used to seeing tracer fire. Mm-hmm. So they were sort of showing us tracer fire. So unless you have your bow and automatic, I don't think that's...
it's not going to help you.
That's not really going to work. And the way the troops were lined up in sort of their trench, it almost felt like this was almost like a scene from one of the World War I movies.
Well, and that emphasis in firepower too, where it's like how much ranged fire can we throw downfield, which is just not... heavily armored infantry prior to firearms can just march through whatever ranged fire you can throw downfield, right? You can't put enough arrows in the air. The French lose at Agincourt, but their infantry marches across the whole field to get into close combat with the English under some of the most deadly arrow fire ever.
Yeah.
And then they lose the close combat exchange, right? But they get there.
Yeah.
On foot. The cavalry fares less well, but the infantry can just march through the fire. And so, this sort of firepower just tearing apart an enemy attack is a very modern way to think about how these exchanges would work. I should also note there's the whole thing where all the archers are getting ordered to knock and then draw and then release. Ancient and medieval archers did not volley fire. There is no evidence that they did. When you think about it, it doesn't make sense, right? For a war bow, you're exerting somewhere between 100 and 180 pounds of force to keep that string back. You're not going to want to wait until the guy tells you to let go. And if you have your archers hold at draw, you're going to exhaust them in literally just a few seconds. If you want them to fire more than one arrow, you need to let them fire in their own time.
And also, volley fire is something that's really designed for muskets,
yes.
Right? It's a completely different idea.
Because it's all about slow reload time.
Yeah.
Interestingly, the Han in China volley fired with crossbows. But again, slow reload time. But yeah, the battle plan itself also isn't very Roman in a weird way, right? It's this hammer and anvil thing where the legion's going to advance and then the cavalry emerges out of the forest to win the battle. And that's just not a very Roman. The Romans do not expect to win battles with their cavalry. Roman cavalry sucks. It's just not very good. The Romans are a bit better at it in the Empire because they can get other people to serve in their cavalry. They can get Persians or Gauls or Sarmatians recruited to their cavalry, and those guys know what they're doing. But Roman cavalry generally is pretty lackluster. The Roman hope is that the cavalry will hold the flanks long enough for the infantry to win in the middle. The Romans expect the infantry to do the winning, whether those are legionary infantry or auxiliary infantry. I think it's notable here, all of the guys who are equipped like auxiliaries, they're all archers. A lot of Roman auxiliaries were heavy infantry, just like the legions, who would have gone in with the legions, probably on their flanks. So that's a little odd. The actual advance, it starts out really well. The Romans advance in their nice, neat lines with defined units. They're not quite the right size, but I'm okay, this is good. And then it goes downhill from there. The Germans are also doing volley fire. And so the Romans do a testudo to block the volley fire. The testudo was never a field battle formation. That was for sieges.
No, that was embarrassing, that bit.
Yeah, I was no. And then the Romans all forget to throw their pila. Roman soldiers carry 2 heavy javelins that they throw before charging into close combat with swords. This was a key part. And you see the guys carrying them. They have them, but they don't throw them. One wonders if prop safety is the issue here.
Yeah, not a problem the Romans had.
Yeah, no, not.
I will say with the testudo, I think that what actually is going on there is they're setting up for when they use it in the arena. Right. They're setting the formation up because Maximus is going to do it in the arena. So they have to do it to show kind of what he's doing. But otherwise, I agree with you completely. There's no reason that would be there.
No, as storytelling, it makes, because it also shows the professionalism of the Legion, right? And how capable they are. And so I think it as storytelling, it works. As history, not so much. There's a lot of that in this movie.
But one thing I thought, that the cavalry charge through the woods, I think, that's not going to end well, trying to charge your...
No, it's a bad plan. Cavalry charge through an old-growth forest is a terrible plan. You are going to lame every one of those horses, and you will have made it 10 feet. It's not a good plan. Horses evolved on the Eurasian steppe. It is wide and flat, and there are no trees. They are not built for forests. And for cavalry-heavy armies, dense forest was a wall. When ancient commanders plan battles, areas of forest are treated as barriers the same way you would treat a river or a mountain. You're I just can't go into that. Especially not with cavalry. You could send light infantry. But even heavy infantry that expects to fight in formation is going to really struggle in a forest. So no, you're not going to do that. Also, shock cavalry should have spears. They all have swords, which is fine. They all have the wrong sword. They should all have the spatha by this point.
A spatha is what, sorry?
But yeah, sorry. So the Romans in this period have essentially 2 swords. The gladius is the shorter infantry stabbing sword. That is the Roman sword the Romans have been using since 200 BC, 400 years prior. The Romans have also taken to using the spatha, which is a longer slashing sword. It's still straight-edged, which they've adopted from the Gauls. And it shows up initially in auxiliary units and on cavalrymen, and then as we get into the late antique period, it eclipses and replaces the gladius, and you eventually get a point where everybody's just using the spatha. And the spatha, along with the quote-unquote Viking sword, is sort of one of the two ancestors of the entire European medieval sword tree. So the spatha is dad, and the Viking sword is mom, and then all of the medieval swords are kids. And the gladius is the bear branch that doesn't have any children. Somewhat ironically. So by this point, I would expect the cavalrymen to be using the spatha, which would be longer. It makes sense. You're up on the horse. You want a long sword that can reach down to the infantrymen below you that you're trying to hit. I think the broader problem, by the time the cavalry comes in, the battle is devolved into this pell-mell chaos sort of thing that Hollywood loves, but was the thing every commander on the battlefield is trying to avoid. Roman soldiers are trained to fight in formation. Now, they're not like tight shoulder to shoulder. They have fairly wide spacing intervals. Each man is occupying a meter or two of space, horizontally. But they're still supporting each other, because if you're a soldier, right, your eyes are in front of you, you're facing enemy, you're really vulnerable to the sides. Someone could blindside you really easily, so you need the guy to your right and your left. They're covering you, and then the next guys and the next guys and the next guys. And of course, the same is even more true behind you. And so that block is then secure from the front and more effective. And so you would never want to devolve into this kind of crazy fighting. The Romans certainly didn't. But actually, what we're told in the sources about how the barbarians of Europe fought, the Gauls and Germans and Goths and so on, is that they fought much the same way with close order infantry and spear and shield walls. So they would also be looking to try and maintain a coherent front. So what we should see is not this sort of like crazy mass, but actually two fairly identifiable lines of infantry that come together, and then there's a sort of killing line where they are stabbing and slashing at each other in this sort of line of contact, both of them in relatively clean formation behind it. And then you might see gaps and tears open up and eventually a collapse in some portion or the other. Generally not for the Romans. The Romans have the advantage of they're much better armored than their opponents, so they tend to win these head-on-head collisions. But so there shouldn't be this kind of crazy everybody fighting everybody mayhem. No one in this part of the world fights that way.
Just one last question on the battle, because I'm sure you're aware of Kyle Harper, who's written a lot about disease. And he has this idea that the Roman soldiers are really quite weedy compared to their sort of barbarian equivalents, because they have this pressure of disease, which perhaps the barbarians don't have so much. And I question that a bit, because I think the Roman soldiers, they march these incredible distances, they're carrying these incredible loads, and this idea that they would have been, you're carrying two pilums, you're carrying a shield, you're carrying a mail. You can't be that weedy if you're carrying that kind of stuff around and going into battle.
Well, we know at this moment that the Antonine Plague hit the Roman army really, really hard. Because we know there's a year Marcus cannot campaign. The army is so decimated. But we also know that it hit the Germans pretty hard, because there's a migration of Germans into the Roman territory to repopulate some of the areas that had been depopulated by the plague. So it's hitting both sides. And also, if the Romans are not campaigning, well, nothing really happens on a military front at that moment either. So the Germans are also struggling to campaign along that front. So I think that what we have to imagine is, the Germans are living in less dense settlements, but the disease we're talking about is probably smallpox. So when we're talking about the plague in the 250s, where this is some version of an Ebola, that is going to affect an urban population much more seriously than, say, a spread out rural population like a German farming community. But smallpox, I think, is kind of going to be equal opportunity. And so I think we have to imagine it's hitting German abilities to fight almost as hard, or if not harder, than it's hitting Roman abilities to fight.
But I was thinking more about, just as they turn up at the battlefield both fit, is the Roman soldier shorter and weaker than his barbarian equivalent?
Shorter, possibly. Weaker, probably not. So the Roman military diet is actually really ample. There's been some work on reconstructing this by Paul Erdkamp and Jonathan Roth? I think that's right. It's pretty ample, and there's a lot of fitness training that goes into the Roman legions. So the Roman soldiers would have been pretty physically capable. They're taking down more than 3,000 calories a day. But I do believe there is some archaeological evidence to support the contention that people inside of the Roman Empire, in part because of the grain-heavier diet maybe and for other reasons, do seem to have been perhaps a touch shorter than the barbarians, in quotes, on the other side of the empire. And our sources seem to reflect that kind of understanding but that doesn't necessarily mean much about strength, and having a few inches on your opponent isn't that much of an advantage in a sword fight. I think you also want to definitely separate, right, the average Roman soldier from the average Roman peasant. Where, I think if you're looking at your average Roman farmer, there is actually some evidence that the higher population density and ironically higher standard of living in the Roman Empire brought with it some negative health impacts that express themselves in things like lower height based on average bone lengths. I think Jongman's done some work on this, though the evidence is tricky. But how much would that have pertained to the kind of guys that are going into the army, where, obviously the army is going to try and recruit the great big fellas. And soldiering paid reasonably well. So I think mostly they're going to recruit the great big fellas. And
I think the other, sorry, Bret.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think the other thing about it is by the time we're in the 2nd century, especially the late 2nd century, you're not recruiting mainly Italians. You're not really recruiting many Italians.
Right.
And when we look at the evidence that we have for, say, the health of populations, you can pretty much see in Italy, the urban population, the Romans really don't want to recruit them. Even in the late Republic, they don't want to recruit people from the city of Rome because they're not healthy. You want peasants. And by the time you have the empire, by the time the empire is in the 2nd century, you're recruiting people from places like what's now Serbia and Croatia and to a lesser degree Gaul. You're getting, you're intentionally choosing particular places where the populations then build a military culture of recruitment. And when we start seeing 3rd century emperors emerging from these places, some of the things that are commented on is that they're gigantic. Maximinus Thrax is a perfect example of this. He's a figure who comes from Thrace. And every source talks, they talk in really elaborately exaggerated terms, like he's 8 feet tall and he 7 pounds of meat at every meal. But this is who you're getting. And so I think the idea that you can look at, say, like the size of the average person in the city of Rome and extrapolate that out to a legionary is not going to be true at this point. And it wouldn't have been true for hundreds of years by this point.
Okay, so let's move on from the Well, do you have anything more on the battle, Bret?
No, I think that's a good point to end on.
Okay, so let's move on from the battle. We have at the start of the film, during the battle, we have Richard Harris as Marcus Aurelius looking on grimly as Maximus wins the war for him, or wins the battle at least. And Ed, you aren't, from memory, you're not a huge fan of the Antonines. Are you a bigger fan of Marcus Aurelius than the others, or a lesser fan?
I think Marcus basically handles a really, really difficult set of circumstances about as well as anybody could. I think there's an understanding in Marcus that when you're faced with these overlapping crises, and they're major crises, when he takes power, he actually has a co-emperor who's supposed to take charge of affairs in the East and dies. And this is also, when we talk about Lucilla later, this is part of the drama with his daughter as well. What Marcus is able to do while dealing with, the loss of part of his administrative structure and the duty sharing he had expected to be able to take advantage of, he also gets hit with basically a plague that kills, who knows, 10, 20% of the Roman population, with really clear evidence that it's causing depopulation and a collapse of the local urban aristocracy across the empire. It is a really difficult set of things to deal with. And what Marcus basically decides to do is create a kind of almost a rhetoric of national improvement, where he lines up people and he makes it explicit that he's choosing them for duties that he knows they can perform. They're not going to be blamed if they fail to do them, but he wants to praise people for succeeding. And he creates a kind of culture of a buy-in culture of success in the Roman Empire that's all built around kind of making things continue to work, and adapt to these crises and adapt to these really fundamental breakdowns in how the empire was supposed to function. So I think under those circumstances, it's very easy to imagine the empire collapsing or falling apart or failing to function. It's very easy to imagine something in the 170s that's like what we see in the 250s, where that very thing happens. You have emperors who are not capable of bringing people together and fighting together, and rebuilding and restructuring the urban elite. And what you get is a breakdown in central authority and people overrunning the frontiers in both the north and the east. That very well could have happened in the 170s, and it doesn't. And instead, what emerges is an empire in the 180s that actually seems to be functioning pretty well. I mean, the empire he leaves for Commodus is a functional state. And there's a remarkable passage in Cassius Dio where he basically has given you a whole rundown of how terrible it's been under Marcus. You know, all of these effects of plague, all of these, this endless warfare, all of the crises that Marcus is continually dealing with. And he actually says, this is the end of a golden age, and after this, we're moving into an age of rust. And so Marcus is the golden age, which, you know, is a kind of retrospective view of this. But you have to imagine, for the people living through this, it's really hard to imagine, you know, someone looking back and saying, well, the 2020s were a golden age for the world. And yet that's kind of what Rome is facing, but times 5 or 10. And so to have somebody like Dio who lived through this, who then can look back at the reign of Marcus and say, you know what, like this was as good as we ever had it. He's not talking about the conditions of life. He's talking about the conditions of political leadership. And so I think there's a lot. Marcus's tone and style, I think, is very cold. He's not a warm, fuzzy kind of guy. I think the movie captures that pretty well. His wife, I think, was pretty frustrated with him. His children, I think, at times, especially his daughter, were very frustrated with him. And generally, I think people respected him. And I think they maybe loved him in the way that you love a kind of stern and fair leader. But nobody was looking at him and feeling sort of warm fuzzies. But the conditions were such that that kind of leader was probably the only kind of leader that could keep the empire functional and you know, sustain Roman power and Roman governance across this really vast space in conditions like he faced. So yeah, I think he would have left you cold. I don't think that you would have liked to have a drink with him. He definitely would have been a fun guy to sit down and, you know, banter with. But I think he was the absolute right guy for the moment.
Just to amplify that, I mean, I think you talk about the crises he's facing, and of course also it blows a hole in the budget, which is the other thing. Like, he does not have the funds to do any of this, you know, really clearly. You often have to take the sort of sources moralizing about imperial finances with a grain of salt, but you can watch the silver purity of the currency to get a sense of what's going on pretty clearly. And, you know, Marcus Aurelius is faced with two fairly difficult, intractable wars, one in the east, one in the west, and a plague. He supposedly sells the imperial silverware to fund the budget. And you look at it, you're like, checks out. You know, there's a real struggle in his reign to keep the purity of the denarius up, more or less does. Commodus won't. But no, I mean, like, just a huge set of challenges. I mean, for listeners, you know, Marcus is one of these emperors we can actually get a decent personal sense of because he writes to us.
Mm.
So you can go read the Meditations. I mean, I think Ed is spot on. You can admire the guy, but he's not warm and fuzzy. He's not like, I'd really like to go get a drink with Marcus Aurelius. Like, no, he's going to tell you shouldn't be drinking, and have you heard about Stoicism?
Yeah, I mean, actually, the Meditations are great because he tells you why he's doing what he's doing.
Yeah.
I mean, the strategy of, I'm going to find people and give them only tasks that I think that they can perform, that's in the Meditation.
Yeah.
I mean, it's in other sources too. But Marcus says, this is why I'm doing it. And the other thing about Marcus is he was identified by Hadrian as the successor to the successor. Marcus had spent his whole life preparing for this job. I mean, really, his whole life preparing for this job. And so he is like an adolescent, more or less, when Hadrian identifies him as the successor. And this is a moment of really serious crisis for Hadrian because Hadrian's identified successor dies before Hadrian. And so he's scrambling in this moment of like the final illness of his life to find somebody. And he finds a placeholder in Antoninus Pius, but the guy he really wants is Marcus. Mm-hmm. And so Marcus was, I think, worn into this not warm and fuzzy guy. Like there wasn't a life there that wasn't running the empire. And he took it very seriously. But that kind of thing takes a serious toll on you too. I mean, he was not old when he died.
He's 58 or something.
Yeah.
And you can read in the Meditations. You can feel it. You can feel the toll he's taking on it. I'm a real fan of the Meditations, but it's a tough life.
Okay, well let's move on from Marcus Aurelius, because he doesn't sound to be a fun guy to spend time with. Let's move on to somebody a bit more fun-loving, a bit, somebody I think we could all enjoy spending time with, and that's Commodus. And he sort of arrives, after the battle, which is sensible, hoping to be named heir. And that's what the whole movie hinges on, the fact that his dad has decided instead that he's going to hand over power to Maximus, who, despite being a military man, will somehow restore the Republic. So can we talk a little bit about both the idea that you might restore the Republic and also how succession works in the Roman world? Because up until that point, hereditary succession over the last 100 years or 80 years or however long it was had sort of become a thing of the past. So I don't know which one of you wants to take that.
I'll jump on that because I think there's a really interesting take that we miss on this and that historians miss on this. So first of all, Commodus had already been named successor. He already shared Marcus's power. That was done in 177. There was no question that Commodus was going to succeed Marcus. But the other thing that is really important to understand about Commodus is not just the son of an emperor. He's the grandson of Antoninus Pius because Marcus married Antoninus Pius's daughter. But he also, because of the way the Antonine dynasty is set up, he's also very deeply connected to previous Antonine emperors as well, because the masculine succession is adoptive. I mean, they're all vaguely related to each other, but there is actually a straight kind of matrilineal succession where you actually have hereditary succession through the women. And so the fact that he is the daughter of an emperor who is himself connected back through Metidia and others to Trajan, you have there an idea of succession that, because there are not male children, doesn't look hereditary. But the Antonines are really, really strongly emphasizing this succession through women. And you can see this actually in the coinage, because there's a progression of the coinage from, for the women, where they start by celebrating the marriage and then they celebrate the children. And so you have these coins of Antonine empresses where they're holding the children, including Commodus and Lucilla on a coin of Faustina, the wife of Marcus. But there's a real clear emphasis on the women then become Augusta. And so the legitimacy through the women is something that is really strongly advertised. And it's quite important because the first time that you have regular large-scale issues of coins of empresses is by Hadrian. And he's putting out coins of his wife Sabina, who was his connection by marriage to the family of Trajan. And so the women are really, really important in how this is structured. So when Commodus is born, he's also the first imperial heir who's born to a reigning emperor. So you had hereditary succession before. Tiberius was adopted, but Tiberius had planned for his son Drusus to take power, and then Drusus dies. Claudius was followed by Nero, who was adopted, but Claudius's son Britannicus was also supposed to be considered for succession, but Britannicus was killed. Titus follows Vespasian. Vespasian's other son Domitian follows Titus. Hereditary succession had happened, but those people who follow, like, say, Titus was an adult when Vespasian takes over. So there had never been a child born to a reigning emperor who then takes power. And so Commodus has a whole bunch of reasons to imagine he's going to be the successor. First of all, it was legally already mandated. He already had the power. It was defined in a way that was recognizable to all Romans. He even shares a triumph with Marcus, or he shares sort of a celebration of victory with Marcus. He also is the son of an emperor, the first if you're in the Byzantine period, the first Porphyrogenitus that you ever have, an emperor actually born, or son actually born to a reigning emperor who will take power. But then also you have this matrilineal connection that links him to previous emperors as well. There was never a person who was more qualified to be emperor. And so the idea that Marcus is looking to do something else is absurd. The idea that in 180 AD, anyone in the Roman state is thinking about a republic is absurd. It's, the premise is something that doesn't work at all. And I think when you actually look at this, the way Commodus behaves in the first year and a half or so of his reign, Commodus is actually behaving as a kind of conventional and establishment figure until Lucilla tries to overthrow him. And then you have Commodus move in a different direction. But I think, if it's 180, you have absolutely no indication that anyone would imagine anyone but Commodus succeeds Marcus. And you don't also have any indication or any reason to imagine that Commodus is going to do a bad job. So far, everything is kind of trending in a positive direction, and it really doesn't take a turn until, 182 or so.
Can you say a bit more about the plot against Commodus? Because I must admit that's something I wasn't so aware of.
So Marcus Aurelius has, 10, 12 kids? I can't remember. You have these horrible coins. I mean, I feel for his wife Faustina, because you have these horrible coins where, it says fecunditas, and it has her holding, like 2 babies with like 4 kids around her legs. And, and a number of those kids die. Commodus was actually a twin. His twin brother dies. But Lucilla is much older than Commodus, and she's married to Lucius Verus, the co-emperor of Marcus Aurelius. And she actually does have a child with him. And so in this way of presenting Antonine empresses, you have the kind of Concordia image of her kind of coming together and joining Marcus's family with Verus's family. And then she has the child, and she gets this nice little fecunditas kind of image, and she becomes an Augusta. And then Lucius Verus dies. And the question then is, what is her status? It's very, very rare for someone to become an Augusta and not hold that status forever. I'm not sure when the last time anyone who had the status of Augusta had it removed. Maybe Caligula's wife, Caligula Platylla, I think is her name. She might have had it removed, but that's the only time offhand that I can think about it. So there's lots of privileges that come along with being recognized as an Augusta. And when Marcus then sees her as a kind of eligible person to solidify his political position with the Senate, so she marries him to a kind of crusty old senator. And her mom is very unhappy about this. She's very unhappy about this. They try to get the marriage stopped. It doesn't actually happen. This marriage goes through, and she's worried about her position. And so when Commodus takes power, he recognizes a few status symbols, even though she doesn't really have this title of Augusta. He recognizes a few status symbols that she can still have. And one of them that the movie gets right is she gets to sit in the imperial box in the Colosseum. And that's a big deal for her. But there is a very serious status anxiety by Lucilla that in 182 leads to her contriving with a relative of her husband to try to overthrow Commodus and potentially get her husband appointed or in some other way seize power from Commodus. And the betrayal, because Commodus at this point is about 20 years old, the betrayal to have a family member do this with close associates that well does really send him kind of reeling. And so the movie is right. Lucilla plots against Commodus. The movie is wrong about why she's doing it. She's not in any way doing it because she wants a republic to come back, or because she has, Maximus who's sitting there waiting to take over. There is no Maximus in the history. But she does actually plot against Commodus. It fails in large part because the person she was working with was an idiot and kind of announces this dagger is coming for you and doesn't stab him. I mean, very sort of Marvel comic book execution. But that part is right. She does actually plot against her brother, and ultimately he does, over time, first exile her and then arrange to have her killed.
Do you think there's some sort of a parallel that you can draw with somebody like Nero? Because Nero, he becomes emperor, I think, even younger than Commodus. I think Nero's 17 when I looked it up. And he dies same age, 31. And he also has plots against them, again, where they're incredibly badly organized, where they spend, months and months not doing very much. I just think it's extraordinary that you can allow a 17-year-old or a 19-year-old to sit at the top of the government. And are they really sitting at the top of the government, or who's really running things? Or are they running, or is anything being run? Does the Roman Empire essentially run itself?
So I think there's a couple things. So with Nero, initially, he's basically a trustee. He has, trustees from the Senate who are helping him. So Seneca and Burrus are these two guys who really help Nero run the empire. And eventually Nero gets tired of them. Burrus dies, Seneca kind of goes into retirement, and then Nero kind of goes off the rails in the view of the Senate. The interesting thing about Nero is Nero actually makes a pivot and does quite a bit to appeal to other segments of the empire. And even though he ends up dying in a very significant action by legions in Gaul that basically refuse to support him anymore, and the Senate then removes their legitimacy from Nero, and Nero ends up committing suicide. Even after Nero's death in 68, there are fake Neros who show up in the 80s, even early 90s, who build upon the fact that there was actually considerable support for Nero among certain segments of the Roman population. And two of the emperors in the year of four emperors, the year that Nero and Galba and Otho and Vitellius all are emperor, both Otho and Vitellius did things that were pro-Neronian. In one case, Nero had a book of poetry that was suppressed, and Vitellius brings it back and actually reads from it. So even in the case of Nero, it's complicated. But when Nero falls, there's really significant opposition to Nero that has arisen, especially in Gaul and in Spain. When Commodus falls, it actually seems like it's palace coup. There is no great resistance to Commodus that we can see. I mean, people are upset about him. But when he actually dies, the story we're told, which is very suspicious, is that it's his lover who hires someone to poison him, and then the poison doesn't work, so they somehow get a gladiator or a wrestler in to strangle him in his bathtub. And really, when you start unpacking it, what you see is that story can't be true, first of all. But then second of all, there's different layers to this story that are built on over the course of almost 20 years. So Commodus is done in, it seems, by the guy who follows him. I mean, this is my suspicion, is the guy who follows him overthrows Commodus. But there is no great revolt by the armies. There is no Senate that votes him out of power like happened with Nero. He's in power, for basically for 12 years, more or less. And he falls not because there's a massive sort of outcry against him, but because of a palace coup run by probably relatively few people. And even the Praetorian Guards are taken by surprise when he dies. So I think when we look at Commodus, the thing that's really hard for us is this is a guy who's in some ways a pretty sympathetic guy. He's an 18-year-old kid. He's been prepped for this job. He does it all right initially. And then his sister tries to have him killed, and he kind of goes off the rails. And he does legitimately go off the rails, doing things like renaming the city of Rome, renaming most of the legions, renaming months in his honor. He does really significantly go in a direction that is not making the Roman state, a normal and functional and happy place. But a lot of the empire was very far away. A lot of the governors were very capable of slow walking their way to not following orders until their term ends, and then someone else comes in who does the same thing. It's a strategy that we know governors are doing. Even under Caligula, we have references to governors who are deliberately doing this. Commodus's ability to make people uncomfortable was pretty significant. Commodus's ability to really sabotage the running of a big and complicated organization, I think, is relatively limited because of the condition of the empire that he received. And also because Commodus wasn't particularly interested in micromanaging what people were doing in the provinces.
Can we talk a bit about the feel of the film and sort of the sets and the costumes? Because for me, there was quite a strong sort of Leni Riefenstahl vibe, as we enter Rome, and there's this, we fly through the air, and there's a big eagle and so on. And then there's a distinct, Albert Speer feel to the way they've made the Colosseum even more massive than it is, this sort of vast building. And then they have this huge parade ground in front of this, these enormous set of steps, which I'm not quite sure what that was meant to be, whether it was meant to be the Temple of Jupiter or whether it was meant to be anything at all. And then you have the Praetorians, and I don't know if they're exactly referencing the SS because they're not dressed all in black, but it's pretty dark purple. So they had a sort of an SS feel to it. So I don't know whether that was the Nazis are kind of referencing Rome or whether that's the film referencing the Nazis. I couldn't quite work it out. But anyway, how did you feel about how Rome was portrayed in the movie?
Oh, I think that they are definitely referencing Riefenstahl, for sure, in that particular scene. And I think it's really unfortunate, but it fits in with the ideological structure of the movie, which is this idea that what you want to do is return a republic to the dominant autocratic state. And so to make Commodus look like, Hitler in a Riefenstahl film, I think is quite deliberate. And I think it's not the only one that does this, right? I mean, Star Wars does this in which The Force Awakens, where you see the sort of First Order and they have their giant Riefenstahl-esque cut. It has become such a famous image that it's almost a shorthand for this is a bad place. This is a place that is autocratic. This is a place that is not ruled by law. This is a place that does not respect its citizens. That wasn't Rome in the 2nd century. Even under a bad emperor, that was not Rome. Even when you look at the emperors that are framed as tyrants, you actually count up the number of people who die, and you're in the tens. You're not in the tens of millions. So, so to think of this as the Nazis is ridiculous. But I think it works with the ideological structure of this movie and the ideology of that particular moment in American and world history. At the end of the Cold War, we're at the triumph of democracy. We're at the sort of unquestioned acceptance that this is where history goes when history is going in a good direction. Romans would not have agreed with that. But the shorthand that you get from quoting Triumph of the Will visually allows your audience to kind of unquestionably make an identification of what this regime is. That corresponds to really a 21st century view of what democracy and autocracy is. It is not a 2nd century view.
Bret, what do you think about sort of how they're portraying Rome?
No, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think the other set of imagery that is getting borrowed is a different strain of fascist imagery, which is sort of Mussolini era understanding of what imperial Rome looked like, where it's all grand boulevards and big temples as opposed to, crowded blocks with tiny streets and big apartment buildings. And so that I think they're blending these to sort of give this sense of this great civilization. I think exactly as I was saying, also the sort of Riefenstahl-esque sort of this is an authoritarian, tyrannical civilization, which is or society, which is I think as he said, even the bad emperors, generally, unless you're in the senatorial aristocracy, you're out of the reach of their badness.
Yes, I always felt Tiberius got a terribly bad rep. He seemed to have the most miserable bunch of senators to deal with, and until he's betrayed by Sejanus, he seems to deal with them with remarkable forbearance was my take. But I sort of thought things had gotten more. This is one of the things I thought was so ridiculous about the film, was that Senator Gracchus is saying in full earshot of Commodus that a man with an army could be very political or something like that. I think, you'd really have to have a death wish to be saying things like that anywhere, least of all anywhere near the emperor. Anyway.
You might wait until you had an army command.
There's a principle that that Tiberius says very strongly, but is reiterated in other places, where Tiberius says, we punish your deeds, not your words, and that's a very strong principle. That even the worst Roman emperors, Domitian is an exception, and Domitian generally I think gets a really bad rap, but Domitian is the last person who really plays in that sandbox of I'm punishing speech, not actions. You do have, you will suffer career consequences, but you will not be charged for speech. you'll be charged for action. And so if you say, that's a problem, and if someone wants to raise an army, you won't be punished for saying that. They might find that you cheated on your taxes. They might find that you did something else. They might be interested in investigating you for fault of some sort, but you have the right to say that if you're a senator.
You are unlikely to get a major military command.
Or anything.
Yeah.
And you are very likely to get investigated for all sorts of things that you may or may not have done. But officially, you could say that, and no one would take the risk of actually punishing you for saying that. But, none of these people have completely clean lives either, and that's the risk.
And Gladiator is sort of, well, it's one in a long line of sword and sandal movies. And I always associate these movies with Christianity. Things like The Robe, I guess Ben-Hur, a whole ton of them, even Spartacus with the crucifixions. It's only got echoes of Christianity. But Gladiator is sort of remorselessly pagan, and quite reasonably so. But is it reasonably so? What was the state of play at that time in terms of religion? And do the Romans believe in an afterlife? Because that's sort of a theme in the film, was that, I'll see my wife and child in the afterlife. Sorry, that's a few things.
I can jump on the religion question if you want.
Go for it.
Basically, I think there's a couple of things that we have to keep in mind about religion, and especially Roman religion at this moment. The first is that this concept of paganism is a construction by Christians to talk about everything basically that's not Christianity or Judaism. And so all of the people in Rome that are classified as pagans are actually doing all kinds of other things, and they don't recognize that they all belong to the same group. They're all just doing what they do. And so there's tremendous religious diversity in the city of Rome in particular at this moment. Just the remains of the kinds of temples that we pull up. You have temples to strange Syrian gods that are in Trastevere. You have the main, Roman Capitoline gods, on the Capitoline Hill. But you have Egyptian gods, you have other regional gods, and they're all in the city. It's a very, very diverse place. And Christianity is there too. But I think the estimates that we see, at least the things that I see as most credible about how Christian is the Roman Empire in the Antonine period, I think you're probably talking about maybe 1%. By the time of Constantine's conversion, which is in 312, you're at about 10% probably. More in the cities than in the countryside. But I think if you were to think about this in American terms, there's probably about as many Christians in the Roman Empire writ large in 180 AD as Jehovah's Witnesses in the United States. It's there. It's definitely a community, but it's nowhere near a majority community. And it's a visible community to a degree, but it's not massive. It's not huge. And it's totally possible for people in certain segments to not interact with Christianity at all. And it's totally possible to be in the urban space in the city of Rome and not interact with Christianity at all. And so in 180, it's there for sure. And if you wanted it to be part of this movie, you probably could have justified making it part of this movie. But you also could justify creating a world where it's really not visible or present, because that also would capture the reality for a lot of people in the city.
Yeah, and it's also, Christianity is, as we should note, is also not evenly geographically spread, and its spread in Italy is slower than in other parts of the empire. So that, I think 1% is about the right number, and it's going to be lower than that in Italy, though maybe a touch higher in Rome because large urban center, hard to say. Certainly there do not seem to be any Christians among Rome's upper class at this point. There would not have been like a secret Christian in the Senate. So the circles that much of the movie moves in, which are high-ranking military commanders, senators, and emperors, you're not going to have any Christians in those circles this early. A lot of these guys will have never met a Christian. Pliny the Younger, when he's governor of Bithynia Pontus under Trajan a few decades earlier, obviously, well, quite a few decades earlier at this point, seems almost befuddled and confused to find Christians in his province, and writes the Emperor Trajan, like, what should I do? These weirdos won't, do what I tell them to. And I keep giving them all of these off-ramps to just give up their religion and not get ultra-murdered, and they keep refusing, and I don't understand. But he seems positively befuddled by a religion he knows very little about, that is largely outside of his experience and is creating administrative headaches for him.
And it's interesting because Pliny was put in that position because he's one of the most experienced administrators in the entire empire. I mean, he's put
Right, he's
there.
very senior.
He's put there because there's administrative problems in that province, and he's sent to fix them. I mean, his title is actually corrector. So the fact that someone like him has never seen Christians or knows what the procedure is for Christians means most administrators never deal with them. And I mean, this is the early second century, but by the late second century, it's similar.
Yeah.
But there's Jews are more prominent in the empire at this stage?
In parts.
Yeah.
So the initial growth of Christianity in some ways tracks the spread of diaspora Judaism, not to the percentage levels because diaspora Judaism starts earlier, but basically in the city of Rome, there is a significant Jewish population. Even under Augustus, there's a significant Jewish population. And we know from materials written under Caligula that this is a population that is deeply integrated. You know, they're citizens, their rights are respected. There's a very strong familiarity among administrators about how to deal with Jews because it's a community that is a recognized community with specific legal statuses. But it's going to be an urban community primarily. You're not going to have rural Jews in Bordeaux or something. Bordeaux you might, but in the countryside outside of Bordeaux, you're just basically going to be talking about a community that's familiar to leadership, but a community that's really an urban community in most parts of the empire.
And an ancient one, I mean, I think, the Roman attitude towards Judaism, right, is informed by their awareness of the antiquity of this religion. The Romans are nothing if not traditionalists. They're like, the Jews have had this religion, they've practiced it for a long time, it seems to work out for them, so they should keep doing it. Is really the sort of attitude. Christianity as a new religion inspires a lot less forbearance from Roman authorities because it doesn't have that antiquity to it.
So the whole selling point of the film is the gladiator fights. Did you feel they were in any way realistic? Was there anything about them that you liked, or was this just nonsense?
Both of us probably have lots to say about this. I'll just say that I think it's really important to understand that gladiators are very expensive and highly trained performers. And so you would never in a million years set up a fight with trained gladiators where they go and slaughter each other in 15 seconds. The crowd would not appreciate it. The crowd would be very, very upset about it. One of the things that is a knock against the Emperor Claudius is he had too many gladiators that slaughtered each other. Generally, this would be more like a bullfight. It was supposed to take a long time and be artful. And most of the time, gladiators would not kill each other. One would win and one would lose. But they're just too expensive to slaughter like that. So the idea that you're going to have a gladiatorial combat that has 20 trained gladiators in a tiny town in the middle of wherever, Mauritania or wherever the initial fights were in the sort of training arena, and you're going to have these people that were purchased for quite a bit of money go out, get training, and then kill each other in 4 minutes is insane. It wouldn't happen in Rome where they have a lot of money to spend on these things. It definitely wouldn't happen in the middle of nowhere where there's, even in that scene, like 48 people watching.
The film doesn't do a good job of separating out that, like, in a given, like, if you have a day at the games, there are several different things that are happening there. And the actual gladiators, right, is like the headline event. These guys are highly trained. The more successful ones are basically superstars. They're, as you say, very expensive. Gladiatorial games run on the you broke it, you bought it rule. The editor of the game is responsible for damages, which, could be rough. But then, of course, since you can't do that all day, you have things like the executions of condemned criminals, which might be staged as mock fights, or they might have beasts pitted against them, or what have you. Our sources tend to think that was the most boring part of the thing. It happened around lunch when everybody was out getting lunch. You might also have beast hunts, and you kind of have to separate here. You have the bestiarii, which are basically just people like have fun getting eaten by a lion, right? And they don't have a lot of... But then you have venatores, trained hunters, who are sort of the kind of almost parallel of the gladiators. They're highly trained. They know what they're doing. You're there to watch someone who knows how to fight a lion fight a lion. And so the film doesn't do a good job of separating these out, that our buddy Maximus is one of these highly trained kind of superstar gladiators. He and his compatriots they would mostly be enslaved. They suffer infamia, the legal disability on them, even if they are free, because it's a disreputable career. So they're very low status in many respects, but they're also really expensive. You would not throw them away. And they could be really famous. And that made them even more valuable because you could do publicity events with them, a thing the Romans did.
How do you mean publicity events?
Have dinner with Maximus. Pay me.
I think that's a really key point, because there is basically a daily newspaper in Rome. I mean, this was started by Caesar. And so what we have to understand is there is a way to use media to build these things up. And if you are paying for games, you want them to be built up. You want people to be excited about them. The other thing that's really notable is animals are very expensive. I mean, the fact that you have leopards,
yeah,
that's really hard to get in Rome, or tigers. I mean, tigers are nearly impossible to get in Rome. And so the fact that you have all of these animals together in a fight where Maximus is going to slaughter the animals and he's going to slaughter a bunch of other trained gladiators. I mean, if you're a Roman senator and you were to get a Roman senator from the 2nd century to watch that scene, you would just watch the dollar sign spin in his eyes, because that is a huge amount of money. And, it lasts three minutes, maybe.
Yeah.
They would never do that. When we have lists of the expensive animals in games, again, by the time of the 2nd century, you're talking about tens of those animals. You're not talking about disposing of 10 lions in one fight where you also have trained gladiators fighting each other. It would never happen. So I think that's another thing that we just have to keep in mind is it's artful. It's designed to take a long time. I mean, if we want to know what a Roman venationes or a Roman sort of gladiatorial combat is like, we should read an account of a boxing match, or we should read an account of Hemingway talking about bullfighting. We should read something where you actually learn what the artistry is. If you go to a boxing match now and it ends in the first round, people are upset that they paid for that.
Yeah.
It would be the same thing if you go to a gladiatorial combat and you have sort of prestige gladiators and one of them goes down in 2 minutes. I mean, you would be very upset. And if he died, you'd be even more upset.
There was one scene at one of the fights which made me smile, where people come out with some baskets and they start throwing loaves of bread at the audience. And I assume this was the distribution of bread to the population of Rome. I thought, I'm not sure it worked like that.
So the bread of bread in circuses is the annona, the annona civilis. This is the distribution of grain in Rome. It was not done by throwing loaves of bread at people. There was a sophisticated system for shipping grain from Egypt and North Africa mostly to Rome. There were state-controlled granaries and distribution points. And you got your grain, because this is how the Romans always do it, as threshed, winnowed, unmilled grains. You're actually getting sacks of grain seeds, of wheat seeds. And, there was a registration system. Not everyone in Rome got to be on the annona. Emperors tweaked how many people got to be registered. It was not need-based. It was do-you-know-somebody based, as far as we can tell. But about 300 or so thousand people maybe on the annona rolls, up with a lot of up and down variation. And so it was fairly tightly, the distribution of grain in Rome was fairly tightly controlled. And I mean, the idea here, right, is that even if you're injecting, that's going to be enough grain to feed a third of the city-ish. There are probably about almost 1 million people in Rome at this point, maybe more. But if you're injecting that much free grain into the city, you're putting downward price pressure on food and grain in the city generally. There is some price data for grain at various points in the Roman Empire, and we know that just the tremendous demand in Rome led to elevated grain prices. Grain in Rome was probably around 6 sesterces per modius, which is about twice the sort of rural average of Italy as far as we can tell. There's a lot of error bars on these numbers. So by sort of funneling grain in, you sort of allow the urban population to support itself at a livable price, which prevents, you hope, mass food riots. But it isn't something like currying favor by chucking bread into the crowd. It's more like a modern system, like a country today, as many do, that say subsidizes household heating or gasoline.
There is a tradition of emperors throwing money into crowds.
Yes.
And so that does happen. And we know, for example, when Elagabalus, who's an emperor in the late 210s, early 220s, when he brings his strange rock god from Syria to Rome, he does have a procession and he throws so much silver coinage out that there are riots and people get trampled. And we have coins that actually show emperors on a throne and somebody standing beneath them and they're throwing coins out. So there was an aspect of that. And senators would sometimes do it in processions when they took office. So this was sometimes done, but it wasn't done with loaves of bread. With all of these things, there are very clear expectations of how they should work. There are very clear limits on what's supposed to happen. And when emperors go beyond those limits, you see in our sources that people are really upset. They are breaking the rules in a way that is seen as really disruptive. So when Elagabalus throws too much money out, sources note that he's doing what emperors do, but he's doing too much of it. When Claudius has gladiators actually kill each other, it's noted that he's doing too much of this. It's something that reflects badly on him. And so these rules about the sort of band in which you can perform these kinds of public actions as an emperor are pretty well understood by this moment too.
Right, and of course you have a sort of lower end too. If you don't, emperors are expected to show magnanimity and largesse sort of equal to their position. And so, like Vespasian, otherwise quite well liked by the sources, gets dinged for not being generous enough, though part of this is that he inherits a budget disaster. Which is actually true. If you look at a lot of the emperors, they get dinged for not being generous enough. Like, the answer is, well, they inherited a budget situation where generosity was not on the menu. But yeah, but excess was also not welcomed, right? The Romans really want stability, predictability, and repetition in their government. They want things to not change. The Romans do not believe in progress, by and large.
That's 100% true. And the idea that an emperor basically doesn't own the empire. They're serving an administrative role for as long as they live, but they are serving an administrative role that's entrusted to them by the Senate and the people. And there are rules to how that role should be, performed and what they should and should not do. And a lot of those rules are unwritten, but they're pretty well understood too.
Ed, you'll probably know this. Is it Hadrian who's traveling the empire and he's asked to judge some minor dispute and he's like, I don't want to, I'm tired, and then the person responds, then don't be emperor. and he stops and he's like, okay, all right, and he convenes a court and judges the dispute because that person is right. Like, it really expresses a sort of what the Romans think about the duties of an emperor. Like, this isn't, you don't own this emperor, you are its steward and its keeper, and there are responsibilities that accord with that.
Yeah.
This is not your private property.
A slightly more harsh take on it came from Tiberius, I think. He said it was like holding a wolf by the ears. I think he was maybe talking about the Roman mob, or maybe he was talking about the aristocracy.
Or the Senate.
I don't know.
Well, Tiberius is I have great sympathy for Tiberius because the guy just wanted to be a placeholder.
Yeah.
He wanted to hold it for a little bit and give it to Germanicus or Drusus. He didn't want to be there for life, and it really wore him out. He was an old man when he took power, and he knew it, and he was tired, and he didn't want to do that job for as long as he did it.
And he did a pretty good job of it up until the point where he's betrayed by his closest confidant. Like Tiberius is paranoid. You would be too if your number two guy tried to have you murdered and replace you in power. Like, I mean, yeah, he thinks everyone is plotting against him, but some of them are. No, I am definitely for rehabilitating Tiberius. I think he gets a bad rap. It's also, Augustus is such a hard act to follow. Some of the heat, because Tiberius also gets dinged for a lack of generosity. And I'm like, well, you can only loot Egypt once.
Okay, so let's sort of try and bring it together a bit, or bring it to a close. Just interested in your overall view of the film, because I felt that it pretty much held up from my memory. I'd forgotten how terrible the dialogue was, and it really was just appalling. And I think,
but that soundtrack.
Yes, the soundtrack was magnificent, and And that actually reminds me, I said before that the film was purely pagan, but there's a scene where the imagery I thought was absolutely Christian. And if you remember, towards the end of the film, Maximus is in prison and Commodus has come to take him up to the arena. And Maximus is more or less hanging from his arms, and the light is pouring down from above. And I thought, wow, this is just a crucifixion scene from a Renaissance painting or something. And the music, as he and Commodus are being winched up into the arena, I thought, well, that's like Mozart's Requiem Mass or something. And actually what I'll try to do when I edit the podcast, I'll try and layer in the music so people can get an idea of what I'm talking about.
There are lots of classical call-outs and motifs in the soundtrack. Like, you hear them. I don't have enough of an ear to tell you what it is. Just repeatedly when you listen to the soundtrack, you're like, those notes are from something. I've heard that chord progression before. I can't tell you where. You need to get somebody else on here to a composer to pile out all of but there's a lot of it.
But bad though the dialogue was, they had Russell Crowe, and as he said, it doesn't matter, what garbage you write, I'm the man who can deliver it. And he really could. He could make anything sound great. So the ludicrous plot structure, where with the senators and so on, I just thought it was terrifically thrilling, magnificent, and I enjoyed it, all over again.
I think there's one thing that I thought was really interesting that they could have done that they didn't. Commodus was actually an exceptional archer. He actually did fight in the arenas. And first he fought like in private. There's a private arena in part of the imperial palace. But we actually have a story of Commodus coming in and shooting, I think it was dropping an ostrich right in front of people laughing at him. There's another scene where he, I think, shoots, I forget what the animal is, but he shoots like 90 of them with 90 arrows. Even people who didn't like him acknowledged that he was incredible at that kind of performance. And I think the film gives you a little hint of that, right? It shows him training. It shows a little bit about him, fighting in the training scenes with multiple people and his swords. But he did fight as a gladiator, but he also was really, really accomplished as fighter of animals. They did nothing with that. I think that's part of maybe why Emperor Commodus was chosen as opposed to Caligula or somebody else, but then they don't use it. And I think there could have been something that would be really remarkable where they, you show what he's actually capable of doing. And you show that he actually did go in the arena. The story about his death is they try to poison him, but he's in such good shape and he's so robust that the poison doesn't work. But the place where he was killed actually was in the quarter of Rome that is next to gladiatorial barracks and a gladiatorial hospital. They actually have excavated what probably is the house where Commodus died. And it's not, the imperial palace had burned in a fire. And so he's staying in a villa that's like specially built right next to gladiatorial hospitals and barracks. So this is a guy who isn't like in the arena by accident. Mm-hmm. He's there because he knows what to do there. He's there because he's as good as a lot of the people that you would bring out to do this professionally. And so, Maxim is sort of striking down this like dilettante. That is actually one of the most unrealistic things in there, because I think if you trotted a Roman senatorial general out to fight Commodus in 192, it would be no contest, but not because the general would cut apart Commodus. General wouldn't last, 2 minutes with Commodus.
Can I get my one quibble in with this movie? My biggest quibble with this movie. Maximus's name.
My name is Maximus Decimus Meridius, commander of the armies of the North, general of the Felix Legions, loyal servant to the true emperor Marcus Aurelius, father to a murdered son, husband to a murdered wife, and I will have my vengeance in this life or the next.
Roman naming conventions are barely rigid, and Maximus Decimus Meridius is not a Roman name. Decimus, which he has as his nomen, his middle name, which is the name of his gens, that is a praenomen. The Romans only have about 28 first names. Only about a dozen of them are in use in any given century. Decimus is one of them, but that should be the first name. Maximus is a cognomen. That goes at the end. That's a nickname. So he should be Decimus Meridius Maximus, although I don't think there is a gens Meridia for him to be a member of. We have a decent grasp of most of the major senatorial gens, so we ought to know. But that was something that I'm like, why couldn't he just be Decimus? That's a fine name. And people can still call him Maximus if that's his cognomen. It was perfectly normal to call people by their cognomina in Latin, very standard. So I was like, why couldn't you? It'd be such an easy change to get his name right.
Leaving aside your quibble on the names, how do you feel about the film? Do you find it enjoyable, or does it just try your patience? What's your feeling?
Oh, I think the film is great fun. I enjoy watching it. You have to suspend your historian brain to do it, because there really isn't a lot of history in here, apart from the names in some vague sense that Commodus was not perhaps a very good emperor. But as a story, as drama, I think it works really well. I carried a bit by the soundtrack, but if you have a great soundtrack, let it carry you. No, I think I enjoy Gladiator. I watch it every few years, and it's fun enough, but it is not history.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's more Game of Thrones than history.
Yeah,
and that's fine.
Have there been any good Roman films? Any good ancient history films that you feel caught it, or is it just impossible for us to enter into that world now?
I think it's possible. I can't think of any offhand. You would have to really have someone willing to take a risk on a film that could fail spectacularly. But I think you could do a really good film, like a Godfather type film, where you focus on a family or a small group of people. But it would be high risk, because even if you did it well, you might not find an audience. And I think with Gladiator, a lot of the things that they do there are prepackaged to find a good audience, and they did.
Yeah,
I suppose for the military historian, like for battle scenes, I have two kind of ancient battle scenes that I think actually more or less work. Gaugamela from the Alexander, 2004 or whatever. They actually get Macedonian tactics more or less right. The Persian army is rubbish, but they get the Macedonian tactics more or less right, which is really impressive. There's some big sweeping aerial shots of the syntagma of the phalanx moving forward, where you can see the 256 men blocks, which is fantastic. And the opening scene of HBO's Rome is, I think, a plausible interpretation of how a Caesarian legion might fight in a fairly, we're real zoomed in. We're looking at just a couple of ranks, but the way that they might fight, with the exception that once again they don't throw any pila, which they should. But more broadly, I think everybody takes a lot of liberties. HBO's Rome certainly takes a lot of liberties. My goodness, poor actual historical Attia must be so upset with HBO's Rome. The sources are like Attia was prim and proper and never said a crosswise word, which is not how HBO chooses to do it. But no, I think you really could. But I think it's right. You'd be taking a risk in sort of telling a story that didn't fit an established mold, the way that, Gladiator really does fit kind of this very established sort of storytelling structure.
Can I put up my suggestion, which would be Monty Python's Life of Brian?
It does make some really key, give some really key insight in.
There's a good Latin lesson.
Yeah, and how chaotic the place is too.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll stop it there. Ed, Bret, thank you so much for taking the time today. That was really kind of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was fun.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. Well, there's only really one way to end this, and from now on, this is how I'm going to end all my podcasts.
Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained? Is this not why you are here?
the end of today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, then I have a big favour to ask. I don't look to make any money from the podcast. There's no advertising or anything like that. I just do this because I enjoy speaking to the guests, and I'm keen for them to get as big a audience as possible, because I think they are really, really good people. So if you could share it on whatever social media channel you use, tweet it out, whatever it is, and even better if you could leave a review on iTunes, that would be absolutely fantastic. Anyway, goodbye for now.